Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kufferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event, Museums as Places of Trauma and Healing, Processing Visitor Experiences, features Dr. Areshni Naidu-Silverman, Senior Program Director of the Global Transitional Justice Initiative at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Dr. Naidu-Silverman will discuss historical trauma and the strategies museum workers use to create spaces of healing for themselves as well as their visitors. This event is part of the Human Rights in Museums series, a collaboration between the KHC and the Gallery and Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College. And the event is also co-sponsored by the Nancy and David Wolfe Holocaust and Humanities Center. This discussion is connected to the KHC's newest exhibition, The Concentration Camps, Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide. The Kufferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. We also want to commemorate today, September 30th, which is Orange Shirt Day. The day marks the beginning of the season when the Canadian government separated some 150,000 Indigenous children from their family. These children were forced to attend the 140 federally run Indian residential schools in Canada between 1831 and 1998. Thousands of children died of disease and other causes, and these boarding schools also existed in the United States. You can find more information about these and other atrocities that were committed against Native American and Indigenous populations in the United States and in Canada in the KHC's exhibition, Survivance and Sovereignty on Turtle Island, Engaging with Contemporary Native American Art, as well as in our newest library guide for educators and students, available also on our website. Now, please be sure to submit your questions for today's conversation through the Q&A button on your screen, as we've disabled the chat for security purposes. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Kat Griffin. She's program coordinator and faculty member in the Gallery and Museum Studies program here at QCC, and she's a faculty member in the Museum Studies program at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. Kat?
I am Kat Griffin. I'm a faculty member and program coordinator for the Gallery Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College. And I just want to share that our program is the only associate's degree in the discipline offered in CUNY. So it's a uniquely affordable entry point into the field. Folks are more than welcome to reach out to me if they have questions about our program. I'm also very pleased to be a faculty member for the CUNY School of Professional Studies Museum Studies MA program. So a big hello and welcome to all the students who are here today, and of course, all of our community members as well. So this program is the third in this ongoing series that Laura spoke about, Human Rights in the Museum. And I also want to acknowledge that in addition to the KHC and the Gallery Museum Studies program from the Art and Design Department, there's additional support from QCC student activities. The programs build on the KHC's mission to use lessons of the Holocaust to educate about the ramifications of unbridled prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. And the series brings together museum curators and other cultural workers to address the roles historical and cultural institutions play in addressing human rights and social justice. Next slide. This series also comes out of a living land acknowledgement resulting from the Native American Survivance Project at the KHC that Laura spoke about previously. Next slide. For this reason, Indigenous viewpoints and voices are centered in many of the events for the series. For example, the second program this fall, which is a conversation organized by KHC fellow Zach Reisinger addressing how museums picture Jewish and Native migrations. We hope you'll join us again for that program on October 28th, where we will also be pleased to launch CUNY's library guide, which is also available today already, on Native American culture and history, authored and compiled by Reisinger. Next slide. For prior programs in this series and those related to Native American survivance, you can visit the KHC's website. And here's just 2 links to 2 of those previous events. Very much look forward to the conversation around how museum staff and museum visitors process trauma. I'm interested in thinking about the possibilities too of healing in these museum settings. And I think this topic feels especially vital since the onset of the pandemic and the related flood of collective and personal loss. Since 2020, American museums of all kinds have also been called to stand up even more for the diverse audiences they claim to represent and to push, and pushed, rightfully so, to offer more complex picture of American history and culture, which necessarily means addressing Indigenous genocide and slavery. While this national conversation may seem recent, in a way, the staff, students, faculty, and community around the KHC have been addressing these issues for much longer, even since the founding of the center itself. And in thinking about trauma and healing at museums and historical institutions, I think of a lot of the incredible programming the KHC does. One program being the earlier Bagels and Brunch program, which for years brought together Holocaust survivors, their family members to congregate, enjoy a meal, a program, and be assisted if needed by professionals trained to support them in processing trauma. I also think of our theater professor, Heather Huggins, who makes use of social presencing theater to assist students with an embodied engagement with programs at the KHC and with the broader world around them. And lastly, as a professor of museum studies, I also teach about the different kinds of participatory opportunities curators and educators can build into museums, which can allow for workers and visitors to have a place to put and to process those experiences they bring with them and the feelings that come up when they encounter painful and complex histories. We are very pleased today and honored to have Dr. Reshne Naidu-Silverman here with us to discuss museums as places of trauma and healing. Reshne is the Senior Director of the Global Transitional Justice Initiative at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. She holds over 20 years of experience designing and implementing transitional justice strategies and programs in critical conflict and post-conflict contexts in Africa, Asia, and MENA, working closely with survivors, civil society organizations, and state institutions. She has written and presented extensively on transitional justice issues, repatriation, justice, truth-telling, memorialization, and reconciliation. She holds a Master's of Arts degree in Dramatic Arts and the second in Forced Migration Studies. She subsequently earned her PhD in Sociology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We are so pleased to have you with us. And without further ado, I will pass the Zoom to you. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Laura. I want to say thank you to KHC for the invitation to speak on such a timely topic. As Kat said, I think it's the pandemic that has allowed us spaces to reflect more and think more about self-care. We've been doing lots of work around, for example, racial justice in the US. And more we've been finding that, for example, the pandemic has allowed people, the public more broadly, to start thinking more deeply about these issues. So thank you for a very timely topic. I just want to recognize that I'm also on Mohican land. So I'm going to share my screen and share a little bit about the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Kat and Laura also asked me to speak a little bit about my background, which I will do. And then I'll share some some information about some of our sites and the way they address trauma. And then finally, I want to share something that I've been thinking about more and more. And some of you may have heard about somatics. And I've been thinking about how to integrate somatic work more into the museum experience and what an embodied museum experience would be. So I'd share a little bit of some of my thoughts about that, and hopefully we can have a discussion after that. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Okay, so I'm a senior program director at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from South Africa. I moved to the US in 2007. While I was in South Africa, I worked a lot in the space of culture, heritage. I actually started my undergrad in dramatic arts, focusing lots on set and theater design, theater for education and development, and gender studies. Following that, I did a master's focused on forced migration studies, where I also looked at the role of memory and how it was assisting in reconciliation, particularly with Hutu and Tutsi migrants that were living in South Africa at the time. So following the genocide, we had lots of migrants move to South Africa, and I wanted to understand a bit more how memory was problematized in that context and how it was used to gain certain benefits and how it was distorted in some instances. Later, I worked at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And while I was at the center, I started working on symbolic reparations, working mainly with survivors of conflict, people that had testified at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we were trying to understand the way symbolic reparations, so when I talk about symbolic reparations, I'm talking about memorials, monuments, museums, memory projects, and how they were assisting survivors in healing, but also the ways in which it could contribute to a holistic reparations program. And at that time, when we did the first initial study at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, there was very little understanding around the role of memory and memorialization in the transitional justice field. More and more at the coalition now, we've begun talking about memory and memorialization as the fifth pillar of transitional justice. But at that time, it was more under the banner of kind of heritage studies, culture. And now, as many of you know, there's been quite a upsurge of memory studies. There's more and more interest in it. And it's become, I would say, almost co-opted into the field of law and politics, social sciences, that kind of thing, and human rights as well. So I'm happy to take more questions later on about that, about my work in the field and how I got to this. But for now, I think I'm just going to move on to talking about the coalition. So the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is a global network of places of memory. We have 300 members in 65 countries. So we have networks in Africa, Asia, Middle East, North America, Europe, Latin America. And Sites of Conscience aim to connect past to present. So initially, when the coalition was first formed, it focused mainly on site and place. So it was actual museums, actual heritage sites. And more, as we were working in the field of human rights particularly, we found that memory was more focused on memory projects. So it wasn't stagnant fixed sites. Instead, they were memory projects. For example, this one that you see here that was recently done in Colombia, where these are actually dolls that represent people that were disappeared during the conflict, and each one has a recording of the person's story, the person who was disappeared. So these kind of memory projects are also part of our network of members. And what all our sites have in common is that they use the current history, as Laura was talking about, use the history of a space to talk about current social issues, whether it's social justice, humanitarian, or human rights issues. And then the second part of it is to move from memory, because often when we think of memory as kind of static. So to move from memory to action in the present. And this could be taking a single action, this could be a broader advocacy and global campaign. So there's multiple levels of action. My program specifically is the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation. And there we are working on forming a more holistic and integrated approach to transitional justice. So whereas transitional justice, for those of you who are new to the idea of transitional justice, it's a set of mechanisms that are used to address past human rights violations. So it could be truth-telling, like truth commissions, prosecutions, reparations, and institutional reform. So reform of the judiciary, police, that kind of thing. And initially, it was situated within a very narrow legal framework, which aims to reinstate the rule of law in post-conflict countries. But more and more, it was found that survivors particularly had multiple needs post-conflict. So transitional justice, the way we're framing it, is to look at it, as I said, in a holistic way, looking at psychosocial support for victims, looking at forensics investigations, identifying the missing and disappeared, reparations, prosecutions and judicial reform, and truth-telling. And when we talk about truth-telling as well, we talk about truth-telling more broadly beyond the narrow time frame of a truth commission, but truth-telling that could be done through memory projects, for example, outside formal mechanisms. So museums as spaces of trauma and healing. So during my entire career working with survivors, the one thing I've always heard from survivors of conflict is their need to share their experiences. They want somebody to bear witness to their experiences, and they want somebody to listen. Because what happens during conflict, and often whether it's active conflict, whether it's authoritarianism, we see it right now in the US, for example, when we're looking at racial justice issues, immigration issues, is that there's lots of silence around certain things. Facts are distorted, and survivors are not given a platform. So when a survivor is given a space to share their story, it actually validates their experience, as well as allows them in some ways to begin that process of healing, knowing that somebody is there to listen and validate that experience. So silence reinforces trauma. I think all of us, if any of you have had very deep secrets that you would not want to share, just the silence of that is exhausting, and often can be traumatizing because you're always afraid about who's going to find out. And so by breaking that silence in some way, you free yourself. Museums, in that way, are spaces for storytelling. They offer platforms for survivors to share their story. They're spaces for catharsis. For those of you who come from the drama field, catharsis is often used within the space of dramatic arts, where there's a climax, and it allows, and then the audience has some kind of catharsis, where it's some kind of cleansing and purging experience. So sometimes it's going through an exhibition or watching a movie where we, at the end of the movie, for example, we cry and we feel kind of cleansed and healed from crying. And that's a form of catharsis. And then lastly, particularly with sites of conscience, they offer spaces for dialogue. When I talk about dialogue, I just want to clarify it's very different from debate. So dialogue allows you to come to the space with no preconceptions or ideas, but rather to be open to listening and hearing another person's point of view, with the hope that it would eventually build some kind of empathy. So lots of sites of conscience focus particularly on creating spaces for dialogue and understanding. If I'm going too fast, please take notes, and I'm happy to take questions after this. So how does trauma affect us as an audience and as staff? So I'll talk about my personal experience first. Often when we in the field and working with survivors of conflict, we hear stories that are just unimaginable, that you kind of cannot believe one human being can do this to another. And I allow space to listen to this, but part of me is not really processing it. And I found that more and more as I was doing this work, when I would come back home from an international trip or being in the field, I would have nightmares and I would talk in my sleep often. So I realized that I needed some kind of, I needed to talk, I needed counseling, and I needed therapy to talk about this work. With the team that I work with as well, I have colleagues, for example, who work in development or who work in communications, and they don't really get the chance to go out in the field as often, but they're still reading the testimonies or the experiences from our reports from what happened in the field. So they also facing secondary trauma. So more and more, we found that our team needed some kind of counseling. In addition to that, I think what really made me realize that it wasn't desensitization, because I still feel when I go out and speak to survivors, or if I go to a museum and see an exhibition that's particularly triggering. But what happens is that there's certain words that I don't pay particular attention to. So for example, I was talking to a friend and I was like, oh, we were at these mass grave sites and this happened. And my friend stopped me and she said, did you realize you talk about mass graves like it's just ice cream, you're getting ice cream on a specific day? And that's when I had to stop and think about how I'm approaching my work. And also as a team leader, thinking about the needs of my team. So what we've done is we've started a debriefing with a psychologist on that my team can reach out to whenever they need to have debriefings about their trips, or if something's particularly triggering. So for example, everybody, as I said, was having a rough time during the pandemic. And so it was an opportunity for them to talk to a therapist and process some of those feelings that they were having during the pandemic. So going back to museum staff and how trauma can affect museum staff, guides are often considered invisible. Very often we would talk to guides and and I don't know how many of you have had this experience where you talk to guides, you know that there's a person, but you don't really stop to think about how this person is processing what they're saying to you. And in lots of these spaces, particularly in sites of conscience museums, lots of these guides are former survivors. So they've actually experienced trauma themselves, and they retelling the story over and over. So the question is, how does this trauma affect them? One of the things just related to this is, for example, during the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was lots of psychosocial support for survivors, and there were lots of cultural healing rituals that were put into place. So when things got really tense during a hearing or after something was particularly heartbreaking, so they heard something particularly heartbreaking, Desmond Tutu, for example, would break out into song and dance. And then you'd see the whole room start dancing. And that was the way they were able to kind of shift the emotions through their body through song and dance. But what research found later on was that nobody paid attention to people who were translating and interpreting. And so they were traumatized, because not only did many of them actually experience apartheid, either as a victim, perpetrator, or bystander, but they were listening to this again. So there's actually a play in South Africa called Truth in Translation, where it's about translators who were part of this truth-telling process, but who but were traumatized through the process. So it's the story of the translators. Often when we go through an exhibition, whether we're audiences or survivors, it's particularly triggering. So for example, the current exhibition of concentration camps at KHC, even though it talks about the Holocaust experience, I think we can relate it in many ways to what's happening at the borders in terms of immigration and forced detention. We can also relate it to racial injustice in the US. So for example, things like ghettos in the US, the idea of ghettos actually, for example, came from Jewish ghettos and enclaves, and that idea was transformed from there to the United States. Things like labor camps and mass incarceration, we still see it now. School to prison pipeline, young people are being imprisoned, but they're also being used as labor. And then medical experiments. We've seen this in the history of US. It started with indigenous peoples, went on to African Americans, and medical. Actually, one of our members is currently doing a study on medical racism, looking at sickle cell patients, for example. So what I'm saying is, you may think that you're looking at an exhibition or taking people through an exhibition that may not directly relate to you, but consciously or unconsciously, there may be different trigger points that relate to what's currently happening in your life. The other thing is generational trauma. There's more studies that are talking about how trauma can be transferred through DNA through generations. So for example, the way if you're an African American person, for example, the way you walk, because you've experienced the exploitation, the fear from slavery, that experience has been transferred through DNA and through your socialization. So you may, for example, walk where you don't want to be seen or you want to be invisible. I know for myself as a person of color, particularly in how my body moves in space, I used to also try to make myself invisible. And I'm also super conscious of how I behave, for example, in a supermarket or in a grocery store. I do not like look into my bag for something, because I'm afraid that if somebody sees me looking into my bag, they're going to think I'm stealing something, that kind of thing. So trauma in how we hold it in our body, but also how we think about it and talk about it, can also be generational. And that could lead to feelings of anger, guilt, shame. But also when we have feelings as audience and staff, we tend to empathize with certain things, and that could cause different feelings. That could bring out different feelings. So for example, the feeling of guilt. So for example, if you're a white American and you are still like fighting the system, fighting against racial injustice, going through an exhibition could cause you feelings of guilt. If you're an African American, you could still feel feelings of anger and fear. If you're if you're an American person with an American passport, for example, you could feel shame for the way immigrants are treated in this country. So there's different feelings that the museum experience can spark. I'm just going to share quickly sites of conscience programs and how we've been dealing with trauma at different sites. So the one site is Constitutional Hill, and that site is based in South Africa. And it was a former prison. People like Nelson Mandela were held there, as well as Mahatma Gandhi. But it was also the site where ordinary South Africans were held because they did not carry a pass. And a pass was basically a form of identification that all Black South Africans had to carry so that they could move from one place to another. And if you didn't have this pass, you were jailed there. So it was a space where political prisoners as well as criminals were held. Constitution Hill has now been transformed, and that's where the South African Constitution Court is. However, and I'll just take you back to a picture of Constitution Hill. This is the solitary confinement cells at Constitution Hill. And so when people go through Constitutional Hill, many people still have families. There were actual prisoners who go through the site now and have feelings of trauma or traumatized. So Constitution Hill has put in place a trauma debriefing program to debrief both their guides as well as visitors. Also, the other part of trauma, as I said, and this is related to silence, is denial. So you'll get people who come to Constitution Hill and say, that is not true, that did not happen, in terms of denying apartheid and the atrocities committed during apartheid. And that's also traumatizing for somebody to hear, especially if you're a guide and you're at the site and you happen to be a Black person. So debriefing can happen in various ways and address multiple issues. We have another site in Argentina, which is also a prison site. And that exhibition and that program brought together female prisoners and perpetrators for them to have a dialogue about the experiences and where they are now. And it offered platforms for apology as well. Lincoln's Cottage is a site in Washington. And it's the house, it was kind of like the holiday house of Lincoln and his wife. And they lost a son when he was very young to illness. And so there's an exhibition that focuses on grief as well as child loss. Then we have two sites in Cambodia. One is Youth for Peace and another one is Kedai Karuna. And these do a very good job of working with generational trauma. So it works with survivors who were victims of the genocide. And young people actually go out and document the stories of survivors, but also they have developed their own kind of reparations program. So what they've done is the kids every year have a sports day and other kind of activities like arts activities, but they themselves identify a community family that is in need of some kind of reparations in terms of, for example, groceries or a little bit of money, that kind of thing. And together the youth raise these funds and share it with the family. And that's and when I think when I talk about trauma as well, it's also related to recognition. So part of trauma is the silencing, lack of recognition. So this kind of program allows people to be recognized by a broader community group and reintegrated into that group as part of the community. They also do multiple Buddhist ceremonies, multiple healing Buddhist ceremonies. And finally, there's the Rwanda Genocide Museum. And that also has multiple programs on site related to commemorative ceremonies and healing programs that offer spaces for people to mourn and begin the process of healing. So finally, the embodied approach to museum studies. So somatics is our ability to be present to a range of sensations, allowing us to be less reactive so that we can tolerate emotions. It allows us to sit with discomfort without imploding or exploding, and it allows resilience and vision-based method for change. So somatics understands trauma where trauma is not in our head, and it's not, and it cannot be alleviated through talking alone. It identifies trauma in the body. So many of you may have heard the phrase psychosomatic. And so if you're feeling traumatized, often you'll feel it in your body. So for example, if you're nervous, you may get a stomach ache, or you may feel queasy, that kind of thing. And I found also for myself, as well as for some of my team members, we were being affected through our body, hearing lots of the experiences. We were being either would have headaches or come back, and I would always come back and be sick every time I had a trip where I heard particularly heartbreaking stories. So some of the questions for us to consider as museum professionals and visitors is, am I constantly aware of my actions and feelings, how I'm feeling in my body, and how those feelings are regulating some of my actions? And so being aware allows us to act in a way that's aware. So, and then am I othering without application of awareness? So for example, if I look at a perpetrator, do I immediately say that person has no feelings? Do I other them rather than understanding and being aware of why I'm othering them? And then again, what do I feel in my body and how? I'm just going to share quickly the experience of the person in this picture, and to understand how sometimes there's no way to verbalize the trauma we feel, either as survivors and even working in these spaces that we work in. So the person here that I'm in this picture, he's from Guinea. And Guinea has had, it's a little country in West Africa, and Guinea has had multiple cycles of violence and coups. There was a coup just very recently. But during one of the coups, he was the president's bodyguard, and he was captured. And he was one of 10 people that were standing in line in a firing squad. And he, and while he was standing there with his back facing the firing squad, he heard somebody say, stop, and somebody had recognized him specifically and said, he's the president's bodyguard, you need to save him. But in the meantime, the other 9 people were killed. So his question is, why was he saved? And he can't, up until today, cannot understand what saved him and why he was saved, and why did he have to go through that experience of seeing 9 people that were close to him, his comrades, who were killed. So when we do workshops with him, he's unable to process lots of it. He's unable to talk about it. Sometimes he just sits silent. Sometimes he walks out of workshops. Sometimes you'll hear him listening to his phone messages, watching videos on his phone, on Facebook. And the only way he was able to actually start talking about what happened to him was through this methodology here, which is called body mapping. And body mapping is a mapping of your body. And on that map, you map the trajectory of your life from the beginning through your experiences of trauma, and then finally what you envisioned for your future. So he was able to understand where the trauma lay in his body and the ways in which it was affecting him and what he wanted for the future. So some of the tools that we as museum professionals should start looking at is things like journaling, ritual, for example. There's one of our sites, it's called the Apartheid Museum. At the end of very kind of harrowing experience of apartheid allows you to throw a stone into like a pond of stones, and that's your contribution towards freedom and liberty and your commitment to contributing. And then things like movement and, as I said, dialogue can also contribute to healing. So some of the things I think would be great for us to discuss is, why do we go to museums? Why do we work in museums? Where does this impetus come from? Why are we engaged in memory work? And what is our purpose? And then lastly, what would a decolonized museum experience look and feel like? And I think that's related more to the question of somatics. Lots of our museum experiences come from a specific white colonial paradigm. And how do we start thinking about a decolonized experience that takes into consideration a full-bodied experience? So I'm going to leave it there, and I think we'll take questions after this.
Thank you so much for that absolutely incredible and really rich and generous presentation. I have a lot of questions going, but I think I'll just bring up one and then hand it over to Laura, and we'll then collect some questions from the audience. So first I want to encourage folks who are here with us to please post questions in the Q&A. I see a few from students showing up already, so please feel free to post things there. One of the things that your presentation brought up as I was thinking of this Survivance exhibition, which from the when it originated, the co-curator Danielle Means, who's a Lakota, and I had been talking about the goal of it being connecting survivors from different communities. And I think we didn't have some of the structure and language that you bring today, but we knew that there was some potential there, and that there could be something, positive and healing within that possibility. But to try to figure out how to think of that as something that would make the exhibition successful versus the more common ways that we measure the success of an exhibition was a little complex. So I'm wondering if you could share anything about some of these exhibitions. I think we also have a lot of potential future curators, a lot of students here. Like how do we talk about or measure the success of projects like these that have really different kinds of goals or additional goals to maybe the goals of more traditional exhibitions or traditional museum projects?
So we struggle continuously with evaluating and monitoring our memory projects. I think that goes to the fact that I think part of it is not just about visitor numbers and all of that. It's about how people are reacting and the change you make, right? So more and more at Sites of Conscience, we've been thinking about longitudinal studies and how, so for example, if you're debriefing and if you have a dialogue, does the dialogue end there? Or for example, does that person go out and have more discussions? What have you changed, right? Because it's hard to measure almost attitudinal change. So more and more, I think I've been looking into longitudinal evaluation studies. And I don't have an answer, obviously, but we're trying multiple models. The other model we're trying to look at is a rubric. So for example, if your goal of the exhibition was to, for example, do dialogue, so you'd measure it on different levels. So one, did people actually talk about it at the museum? Did they talk about it? Didn't they talk about it at all? And was there lots of discussion? Like you can measure it like with the rubrics. So we've been trying to score it that way. And we've also been using a little bit of an outcomes-based evaluation. But I don't have a specific answer. There's so many models out there.
No, that's very helpful. Laura, I think that you had some comment. Yeah.
Rashni, I was listening to your presentation, and I was getting very emotional because so many things that I've experienced in my own journey in this work, you're just talking about constantly. And you talked a little bit about the Decolonized Museum, and this is something that I had the really great fortune to go to Kigali to work with you. And I'm sitting in a room with activists and survivors from across the African continent. And we went to the Kigali Genocide Museum. And I was thinking about beyond sort of the white colonial paradigm that you talk about, with whether we're dealing with trauma intellectually or we're feeling it in our bodies. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about also the European model of memorialization when we are looking at text boards and looking at things almost very clinically versus being, for example, in a Rwandan site where the presence of bones are on display, or in the case of Cambodia, where at the Transitional Genocide Museum at the killing fields, there's skulls that are on display facing outward, but that has nothing necessarily to do with the way local people commemorate and acknowledge what's happened.
Thanks, Laura. So I think historically museums have always had a bad rep. And that is because it's almost considered a space for the haves versus have-nots. There's been such an elitist approach to it. So, and it's been informed very much from a white colonial perspective. Interesting enough, so I'll use the example of Cambodia in terms of bones. There was a picture there that I think I may have shown you guys. It was on one of the slides, but and it's funny because I actually took a photo of bones to put on the presentation, and I thought, no, it's going to be triggering for people. So this one site, Youth for Peace has a site, and it's the youth center I was talking about, and they have a shrine, and outside the shrine they have it's almost like an exhibition. Like panel kind of thing, exhibition, what's it, the glass like storage box. And in there's lots of skulls and bones. And it was so interesting to watch that each of these kids, as they came to the site, they come to clean up the site and they volunteer at the site. But there's also like a little soccer ground right in front of these bones. And as they came, each one lit an incense, went up to the altar there, prayed to those bones, like said a prayer, and then came back. And then they started their soccer game, and then they were cooking at the site. And for me, what it demonstrated is that life and death are so integrated with each other, and it's not the way we see it here. So here these kids were playing soccer in front of these bones, but they also realized these are their ancestors, and they first went to give thanks and respect to them. So I think more and more to look at, and also when I think thinking about an embodied approach, thinking about that is like how do we include ritual at sites? How do we include like this prayer ritual, for example? How do we include movement? For you have done movement previously in your life, and you know how that feels in terms of stress relieving and things like that. So how do we include those kind of things that are not part of a white colonial paradigm and the way we know museums, for us to get a better understanding of the issue, but also for us to empathize them more, as well as reduce our levels of stress in that process.
I think that's such a powerful point about really listening to our bodies versus listening to our brains, and that sort of dissonance. I was actually in a conversation last night talking about bones and talking about presence and talking about absence of these spaces. And in looking at the questions, it's very clear there's a lot of questions about generational trauma and the relationship to these sites. And also someone's asked this question, why is the word conscience used in some of these sites? And I'm thinking about if you could talk a little bit about what's the difference between a museum and a site of conscience, and why that's significant in connecting past to present.
So I think, a usual museum, we go to a museum, we look at an exhibition, and go through the exhibition, and you have all these fields, and you just left with it. Like, you do what you want to do at the end of this. Sites of Conscience presents work in a very specific way, firstly, but also seeks to ask questions, invites the audience to answer those questions, but also aims to have a dialogue, as I said. So, and then it uses the past to connect to the present. So as you guys, for example, you're talking about the Holocaust experience, but connecting it to current issues. Like, for many kids these days, right? They probably like, the Holocaust has no significance to me. But as I said, all those things that the exhibition points to, concentration camps, medical racism, it's very relevant in today's day and age, particularly in the US. So I think that's what Sites of Conscience aims to do, is connect what happened to the past. Like, history still matters. I think that's the bottom line. And how do we create dialogues around that and spark even a tiny bit of action? I think one of the things that stories that my colleagues like to talk about, which I haven't, I didn't experience myself, it was at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and that's one of our sites, and they talk about immigration. And they have this, they used to have this program, I don't know if they still have it, it's called Kitchen Conversations. And a young man and his grandmother went to a kitchen conversation, and they started talking about immigration. And his grandmother said lots of negative things about immigration. And he really, he and his grandmother had a conversation about, because he felt very differently, and what it meant to him and what it meant to her. So even if it allows those spaces in families and for us to call out those issues, or even just have a conversation about it, I think it allows people to start thinking in a more critical way as well.
I'm pulling together a couple other questions. Jill Strauss asked about memory study, and Efe asked about memory study, and Jill Strauss, I think, asked about this idea that we're already memorializing COVID right now. So maybe we'll pull those things together. And can you speak a little bit more about this idea of what memory study is and how that plays a role in what these sites do? So
I think we have this, and I'm up to debate this in lots of ways. So I think we have a constant struggle here in the US about what's memory and what's history. And I think in the US, we often have this search for objectivity. And we, as a team, my team, often question, what is objectivity, right? And I think what I like the most related to questions of memory and history is that I think memory allows for multiple experiences. And so there's an academic, Charles Mayer, when he talks, for example, about truth commissions, he says, you don't have to aim to have one narrative. You can have multiple narratives living alongside each other. And South Africa, and I think that's why truth is a very interesting concept when we're dealing with memory, because my perspective would be very different from your perspective as well as your experience. But a truth-telling process allows those multiple experiences to come to the fore. I think if you have a baseline of, like a moral baseline of what you would accept, I mean, it's not a space for everybody to share their truths, right? You don't want perpetrators to be like, I did this, because you're not giving them the space. But if you have multiple experiences and multiple truths alongside each other, I think you're able to have some kind of, I think that would relate more to memory. And so I think memory is also more fluid and more organic. And memory is constantly happening in the moment. So like the pandemic question, it's memory now. And I think more and more, we saw this with George Floyd as well, right? That memory happens in the moment, and it doesn't have to, and we even saw it with the Confederate monuments, actually. It's spontaneous, and it could happen in a moment, and it could disappear. So I don't know if that's answering your question.
Absolutely.
some of my thoughts.
I think this is interesting to a lot of students because I see Leticia posted that, emphasizing the importance of oral history. And I think the KHC works with this very actively and has for years, gathering the survivor stories, giving students the ability to meet survivors and learn and share their stories, and even following the whole narratives of individuals to build exhibitions around those stories. Which is probably a good time for me to turn it back to Laura. Do you want to,
Yeah, I just have one more question. And so you just talked about narratives, and there are multiple truths. And how do we hold all these things at once? But in the context of an atrocity site or a site of conscience or a museum, some narratives are privileged over other narratives. So, most of my work in Bosnia and Srebrenica is looking at that memorial there and how the story of what's being told is told. And if we look at one of the most infamous sites, Auschwitz-Birkenau, there are multiple victim groups there. There are multiple groups who come back and want to commemorate it in a certain way, even with the presence of a cross and a church on that property. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about that.
So I think when we talk about victims and survivors, we often tend to talk about them as if they're a monolith, and they're not a homogeneous group. Multiple victims have different experiences, different needs, and often I think what we need to be very careful about as memory practitioners is that we don't exacerbate tensions, and therefore they're like trauma, going back to the topic, between each other, right? By prioritizing one group over another. But that said, as I said earlier, I think there needs to be a moral baseline. You cannot, if somebody is claiming a specific their truth that everybody knows is not true, that cannot be included into that into that narrative, right? So there needs to be some kind of moral imperative. But I think for survivors, as I said, there's always, and also memory as a whole is always contested, right? You know this from all your work. Currently, we're seeing it in Rwanda, we're seeing it in so many places. And because, I think part of it is because there's power in it. There's power in memory, there's power in narratives, there's power in whose story gets to be told and whose doesn't. And when I'm talking about power, it's also political power, it's resources, more and more it's who's getting the funding, that kind of thing. So I think we need to be very careful and work in a very ethical way as memory practitioners to ensure that we don't exacerbate tensions between survivors, but also recognize that multiple survivors have multiple experiences as well as needs. So don't consider them homogeneous monolith.
I think that's really important. We've seen that at the KHC, even with survivors of the Holocaust and second generation survivors who come and share their stories. And often there's I don't want to say a competition, although there is a competition of victimhood in many other places. Who survived the most horrible things? I want to thank you for just sharing about your experiences. And, I also just want to reflect in the Q&A, there's been a lot of questions around trauma, second generational trauma. Have we all experienced trauma? And clearly, in the age of COVID, we are all collectively traumatized, regardless of what our political or personal views are about it. And that will definitely be the subject of a future event. Kat, I wanted to turn it over to you briefly. Would you like to add any closing remarks?
I just want to thank you so much for this incredible presentation. As Laura said, the comments show that there's a lot more dialogue this is spurred. And I think when you brought up this idea of whether, or I brought up and asked you this idea of whether things are successful, and you said it had to do with the kind of dialogue that comes out sometimes, you have brought out incredible dialogue today. I know it will continue with my students this week and next week and throughout the whole semester and ongoing. So I want to thank you for that. And again, invite everybody to join us again in October 28th, to discuss two different circumstances of forced migrations and how they're pictured in museums. I think we're going to pick up on quite a few things that we began today. So thank you to Laura and Marissa and Victoria, to the whole art and design department for their support, and mostly to our incredible speaker. Thank you so much for your wise words today.
Thank you so much, Roshni. Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And for more information on all of our programs, including the upcoming October event from the Museum and Human Rights Series, please go to the KHC's website. We hope you all stay safe and healthy and be well. Thanks, everyone.